This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
So it's a huge and existential moment. Could we really be going in a much more authoritarian direction?
These kids, they were brought up with parents that have their faces in their phones all the time. If your attention, which is something your kids want so badly, has been taken up by this box, this rectangular square, of course your kids are going to be like, this must be so important.
The whole idea of spreading a vast amount of information and disinformation and rumour is also in many ways the playbook that, amongst others, of course, the Soviets long developed for propaganda. The level of activity, including flooding the zone, has been extraordinarily intense.
Welcome to The Big Threat, a podcast about the global information wars and how mis- and disinformation are eroding the democracies we live in. I'm Bryce Corbett. In this podcast series, join me on a trip around the world to meet the experts taking up the fight against fake news in what has become a race against time. Journalists, academics, government officials and educators all working their corners of the globe to foster the critical thinking skills that will enable their populations to separate online fact from fiction, one of the defining challenges of the digital age. In this episode, as the United States grapples with the implications of another Trump presidency, the media literacy movement watches on nervously, worried that decades of progress will be unwound in a matter of months. While a Financial Times correspondent offers his perspective, and a visit to a Manhattan classroom shows there's life yet in the fight against misinformation. This is The Big Threat.
Front and center at President Trump's inauguration, a lineup of billionaire tech titans led by the world's richest man, Elon Musk, now a top Trump advisor, sitting with Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, and Google's Sundar Pichai. The billionaires seated in the first row in front of some cabinet nominees. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren writing, "They have even better seats than Trump's own cabinet picks. That says it all."
When President Donald Trump took the oath of office at his second inauguration ceremony towards the end of January 2025, he did so with Silicon Valley's most powerful CEOs seated in the front row behind him. As political signals went, it wasn't exactly what you'd call subtle. These were the men and the companies he was going to put at the centre of his government, seemed to be the message. And despite each of them having checkered histories with the incoming 47th leader of the free world, the tech titans nevertheless showed up and smiled dutifully for the world's cameras. It was, as Trump doubtless intended, a very public kissing of the ring. I found myself in Washington and New York at the time of the inauguration, continuing my travels on a Churchill Fellowship, awarded so I could visit other countries and meet and learn from fellow media literacy advocates. In the last episode, I was in San Francisco, making contact with a leading media literacy academic at Stanford University and meeting an educator teaching teens about public interest journalism. My itinerary then took me to Los Angeles, where scheduled interviews with academics and media literacy experts were foiled by the catastrophic LA fires.
In the coastal neighborhood Pacific Palisades, multiple homes completely engulfed in flames, with desperate residents rushing to get out.
I flew into LA the morning after the Palisades and Eaton fires to find a city in a state of shock, and also to watch as mis- and disinformation flourished in the immediate aftermath of the disaster.
The information that people do not need is the disinformation that has been circulating on social media about these wildfires. AI-generated images and video have confused users by showing the Hollywood sign on fire. We showed you that earlier, when in fact that sign was not on fire.
With depressing predictability, the misinformation meme started spreading online in Los Angeles even as the fires continued to burn.
And there are people who see this information and they take it to be true.
From elected officials offering unfounded theories on the fire's causes to advance their own narrow political interests, to pure disinformation about the rescue efforts, the threat of looting, and even evacuation warnings, all of it heaping widespread confusion on an already chaotic situation. It was truly a period to see the best and worst of humanity. From Los Angeles, I flew across the country to Washington, D.C. for meetings with the Pulitzer Center and PBS, the public broadcasting service. Washington was in semi-lockdown ahead of the presidential inauguration. The White House and Capitol Hill were both surrounded by heavy-duty 10-metre-high security fencing, and police patrolled the large, empty streets as snow from a recent cold snap sat stubbornly on the ground under midwinter sunshine. Farid Mustufi welcomed me into the Pulitzer Center offices in downtown DC to walk me through the work that he is doing, designing educational resources for primary and high school students, connecting them to underreported news stories and also, crucially, to the journalists who cover them. And Leah Clapman walked me through the work she's been doing at America's storied public broadcaster PBS, creating the highly successful Student Reporting Labs. The labs encourage high school kids to create TV news reports in their communities, which are then submitted to PBS affiliate newsrooms for broadcast. It's another initiative that teaches media literacy using the principle that kids learn best when they do.
I've always believed that that's like the most powerful form of news literacy media literacy is when you have created a story yourself and you know what it's like to go out and do an interview, and you know what it's like to pick a soundbite, and you know what it's like to match visuals to words.
Leah admits to watching on nervously as the new administration launches a full-throated assault on public broadcasting in the United States, but says the work that she's doing with Student Reporting Labs gives her hope for the future.
Yeah, I think this started to come up when everyone was talking about fake news. And when we would have conversations with our students, our student producers, they were the ones who were like, every piece of media is constructed. Editors make decisions all the time. Just that level of media literacy is quite striking when the student producers are talking about constructing their pieces. And I think if you're making decisions with your North Star being accuracy and fairness, that's much different than making decisions if your North Star is to like make people angry or to like convince them of this, specific political agenda.
Now in New York, and my first stop is in the gritty back streets of Brooklyn, where I'm about to sit down with Andrew Jack. Andrew is the global education editor of the Financial Times and coordinator of the newspaper's FT for Schools initiative, providing free access to the Financial Times for school students.
So a few years ago, our chief executive was talking to some secondary school students, and they came up and afterwards and said, how come we can't have access to the FT? And given that group, schools, students of that age, are not obvious, logical paying subscribers, we thought actually, why not? It's not damaging our business model, if you like. And on the other hand, it is trying to put high quality content in front of this next generation.
And how has the program been received?
Well, at latest count, we have something like 5,700 schools around the world that are signed up in over 120 countries.
Amazing.
A lot in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, but also here in North America and in Asia and parts of Africa. So even in much lower income countries and even countries where English isn't always the first language, there's been a real appetite and demand.
Do you have a sense of whether young people are attuned to the fact that so much of what they see online these days is either of dubious quality or flat out incorrect?
Yeah, I think a lot of the surveys and our discussions and focus groups with students definitely point to, on the one hand, a sort of news avoidance, a sense that I can't make a difference with this, or there's just so much negative news out there, whether it's around politics, around climate change, around all the challenges of operating in this current world, that they're kind of turning off and looking for entertainment instead. The other thing is we're moving into a world where a lot more of the things that they do read tend to be mediated through their own networks and friends and personal recommendations. So a lot of the perhaps reflection on going to traditional media sources as the reference point is moving towards you go to a preferred influencer or podcaster or TikToker, and they provide their distilled summary of what they're seeing and reading elsewhere. So that presents two challenges. Yeah, one, just a sort of disengagement with news, which of course we would argue is so important to civic participation and democracy and political discussion. And on the other hand, that question of what sources are you looking at, and are you reflecting enough on the quality, the nature of journalism and fact-checking and context that, of course, goes into traditional media outlets.
And the news avoidance that you speak of obviously isn't just isolated to high school students. It's across the general population. Do you think that news fatigue, has become progressively worse in recent years?
I think a lot of the surveys out there do suggest that in many countries there is a growth in news avoidance. That said, I think it does turn out to be very culturally specific. So there are some countries overall where the levels of engagement with news and the number and the, as it were, success of news and media outlets is more or less effective. So, for example, if we look at some of the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, there's a very strong degree still of engagement, both with news and a very thriving and significant media network or ecosystem. If we look at other countries like the US, for example, we see an explosion of alternative and often very subjective and sort of debate-driven outlets as an alternative, while sadly many of the particular regional media or even national media have been struggling financially and with readership and with circulations and are closing down, or at least people are increasingly shifting their reading habits into other areas.
One of the things that I've spoken to other people in the US about is Steve Bannon's infamous quote about the political tactic of, and I quote, flooding the zone with shit. The idea of putting out so much information and creating such a sense of confusion that people just disengage entirely. Are you seeing that happen in the US?
I think certainly since the election of Donald Trump, there's been this absolute explosion of flooding the zone, as you say, executive orders coming out every day, comments, leaks by the administration, particularly to some of the right-wing, non-traditional media. So at all levels, there's this impression of a huge amount of activity. Now, of course, that presents a big journalistic challenge in terms of deciding what to prioritize, what to write about, how to verify the information. And it creates, yes, a huge degree of noise and confusion for readers, consumers of news. The whole idea of spreading a vast amount of information and disinformation and rumor is also in many ways the playbook that, amongst others, of course, the Soviets long developed for propaganda, and this idea of essentially there is no truth, everything can be doubted, therefore everything is of equal value or lack of value. So undermining confidence in science, in data, in evidence, in traditional journalism and media sources in a way that, of course, plays into all sorts of different and questionable political agendas.
Before moving to the US, Andrew worked for over a decade as the FT's correspondent in Russia. As a result, he's seen up close the propaganda tactics used by regimes intent on controlling how their population thinks and acts.
I lived and worked in Russia in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. But of course, there's a long history from the Soviet era of agitprop, as well as other forms of manipulation, compromat or compromising material that might persuade people to say things or to not say certain things. But then in the early 2000s in particular, you started to see this huge explosion in alternative sources of information online, not only first and foremost in Russia for the domestic audience, the Russian language outlets, which began with the takeover of the television stations, of course, as the prime source of insight and information and opinion for Russians themselves, but also the beginnings of organizations like Russia Today, which were broadcasting and publishing materials in English, so for a foreign audience. And so, yes, I mean, you've seen those tactics play out and hugely intensify in the last few years and become very important drivers of public opinion and debate and uncertainty or disinformation spreading around the world. Not just from Russia, of course. We've seen it from many different countries, but that's certainly one that developed a lot of these techniques and continues to use them very actively.
And you would have seen too, having spent so much time in Russia, the impact that exposure over a long period of time has on a general population. You talked about a Russian tendency to keep things in the kitchen, to not engage with institutions because of the distrust, or to simply accept the propaganda because it's just easier to rationalize it and get on with your life best you can.
Yeah, we've seen that in spades, of course, since the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine beginning in 2022, but that's obviously an acceleration of a lot of existing trends. Some Russians were very brave and stood up and criticized. Many of them have been severely penalized, arrested. There have been tragic cases of mysterious deaths and so on as well. There's a mix, of course, of a certain number who absolutely believe in the party line, if you like, the approach of the leader. There's many more who are probably undecided or sort of indifferent, who may choose simply again to avoid the news, to disengage, to think about other things and distraction and not have to debate or reflect on it. And no doubt there are some who are open and susceptible, and either because they believe it or because they're persuaded over time by it, or simply because they just don't want to resist, but they want some degree of reinforcing the position they're in, will accept it. And then, of course, there are people, a minority perhaps, but a significant minority that absolutely opposes what the current regime is doing, but many of whom, particularly after they've seen the persecutions and the threats against those who spoke out publicly, who demonstrated in public, they prefer to internalize. And Russia has always really been a country where loyalty to an inner circle of family first and then friends and contacts second is much more important than a public discourse or belief in government or a willingness to engage publicly when you know there are risks to that. And incidentally, it's sort of a phenomenon that we're seeing now here in the US, where there's been a very much a sort of line of public allegiance to Trump by many people, including Republicans who perhaps historically would have taken a much wider range of views.
You mentioned the Baltic states, and Estonia and Finland in particular spring to mind, who are well known for having gone to extraordinary lengths to make their population as media literate as possible as a reaction to their geography and the fact that Russia is their neighbour and they've been subjected to propaganda over many, many years. They're an interesting case study, I guess, aren't they, in this space?
Yes, and I think often when you look at analyses of approaches to tackling media literacy and dealing with disinformation, some of the countries in that region come up very often and rate very highly. Finland, of course, pushed back against attempted invasion by the Soviet Union successfully. Estonia, of course, was effectively within the Soviet bloc in the post-war era in particular. And so from different perspectives, both of those countries are on the front line. And as you say, in Soviet and in post-Soviet times have been very sensitive, acutely aware of the techniques and the pressures being applied, not least in attempting to try and influence the public discourse and the media that takes place. So on the one hand, they're aware of the dangers and they've developed all sorts of tools to try to respond. On the other hand, I think more generally, and you see this in many other contexts where societies perhaps have a greater degree perhaps of critical thinking still and have pushed back against disinformation, there's a high level of belief and confidence in the role of the state and in public services, a strength of the education system, for example, a belief in the state's capacity to help with healthcare or social services and so on. So often these things seem to go together, and I think that's certainly the case in those countries.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute.
In the months between meeting Andrew in New York and this podcast going to air, the second Trump administration will come out of the gates flying, using its first 6 months in power to start to enact its ambitious agenda with astonishing speed, surprising and dissembling many along the way.
Week one of Donald Trump's second presidency, and a lot has happened.
And while today is his first full day back in office, he wasted no time and signed dozens of executive orders yesterday.
The president has signed 141 executive orders in his first 100 days, more than any other president in U.S. history.
Universities like Harvard will be targeted by the Trump administration.
The White House has given Harvard an ultimatum to ditch diversity programs and muzzle campus activism or lose billions in federal funding.
Law firms will be attacked and libel suits launched against major media outlets, including CBS's flagship current affairs program 60 Minutes. Not insignificantly, at the same time its parent company Paramount is relying on federal government approval to complete a lucrative merger with Skydance Media. A libel suit that Trump will eventually win, forcing Paramount to pay $16 million in damages. And so, keen to get his foreign correspondent's take on proceedings, I check in with Andrew again several months after our meeting in Brooklyn for a stock take at the administration's 100-day mark. We're a good way into the Trump second administration. You're an Englishman in New York. How do you see the next 4 years in the US playing out?
I think the level of activity, including, as we were saying, flooding the zone, has been extraordinarily intense. And I think you have to take Trump both seriously and literally. We've seen a lot of the checks and balances that existed in the first term knocked away. So before you had Congress that was divided, you had perhaps a much stronger and more independent judiciary. You had a lot of officials around Trump who weren't selected purely on the basis of personal loyalty to him and were willing to push back in many ways. These days, it seems that loyalty to Trump is almost the only thing that counts in his appointments. Of course, the Democrats are in a minority position, so the legislative check and balance has gone. We're already seeing open defiance of some of the court decisions, including around deportations, and indeed attempts by some of the people around Trump to attack and threaten action against judges who choose to not make decisions in the way that they've chosen. We've seen, of course, a huge pushback against leading universities, Columbia and Harvard, amongst others, but with a longer list of something like 60 that are being targeted for alleged anti-Semitism, largely seen as a pretext for pushing against policies and ideas within higher education that are perhaps critical of Donald Trump. And we've seen actions against the media, of course, including some very aggressive libel suits and other attempts to target really anyone who criticizes. So we're at a very delicate moment in American democracy. And while I think here many still clearly think that the pain that's already being seen economically, financially, and that being translated into a drop in Trump's ratings in the opinion polls suggests there could be a rebalancing, notably at the midterm elections in a couple of years. There are others who start to say, well, will we have midterm elections? Could we really be going in a much more authoritarian direction? You know, could there be a state of emergency? So all sorts of challenges that really are throwing up questions about the smooth functioning of democracy. So it's a huge and existential moment. And of course, at the very least, we probably have 2 more years almost of executive power with a compliant Congress. And then beyond that, all bets are off. But even if there's to be a rebalancing through Congress, there are many other things that could well continue and perhaps limit the pushback on the Trump administration.
Of course, we've also seen tech companies have been very quick to beat a path to Washington or Mar-a-Lago, as the case may be, and they seem willing to do whatever it takes to curry favour with the new administration. But at what cost to the general public, do you think?
I think there's very serious questions to be answered around that. Now, the tech sector is not a single sector with unanimous views, of course. We knew until relatively recently that certain of the tech companies were taking a much more nuanced view with promises around balance, efforts to control or limit offensive speech or provocation. But of course, we've seen, as you've noted, for example, with Meta, a huge pulling back from those degrees of controls and a new, much more macho, aggressive, right-wing Mark Zuckerberg and others taking stances much closer to the current administration. On the other hand, of course, you've got entities like Google, some of the traditional big tech companies that are in the sights of the regulators for being monopolists. But of course, on the other hand, Elon Musk, as we know, has been playing a hugely dominant role, not just in tech, but directly in government, an unelected individual who's been causing havoc in federal government with massive job cuts and somewhat arbitrary cutting of grants and other forms of expenditure.
And according to Andrew, not even the entry of cashed-up tech tycoons into the world of media ownership is providing any glimmer of hope. When Amazon founder and billionaire Jeff Bezos purchased The Washington Post in 2013, it was cautiously celebrated as a new world lifeline for the storied, struggling old world media outlet. But then in October last year, when Bezos halted the paper's time-honoured practice of endorsing a presidential candidate, spiking the editorial board's plans to get behind Kamala Harris, several journalists handed in their resignations. In February of this year, by announcing the Post would be reimagining its opinion pages to do away with the broad spectrum of differing opinions in favour of a section dedicated to, and I quote, pro-personal liberties and free markets, unquote, the paper had shed over 250,000 disgruntled subscribers.
And then, of course, you've got tech companies like Amazon, where Jeff Bezos perhaps initially seemed like some form of salvation because of his slightly more progressive political views going back several years and his ability to help the Washington Post that was struggling financially. But increasingly there, we've seen many of their commentators and journalists and indeed subscribers leaving as they've put in place new measures and policies, including very tightly clamping down on their opinion columnists to focus on arguments supposedly around free speech and to limit a lot of broader and more critical perspectives.
With respect to the antitrust case, we've just seen Google suffered something of a body blow around the finding that it's been illegally maintaining a monopoly in the online ad market. Do you think the Trump administration is going to see through the breakup of big tech companies?
It's a difficult one because there are so many conflicting interests around all of this. As you said, there's clearly been no shortage of all of the big tech players, from Facebook and X on the one hand, but also through to Microsoft and Bezos, indeed, with Amazon on the other, who are pledging money, supporting the presidential inauguration, funding it, seeking to very actively lobby. And you've clearly got tensions both, as we said, within the tech sector, but also between the tech sector on the one hand and, for example, the populist MAGA base on the other. So there's big tensions both within and around, which could also play out in different ways. You know, we've seen it around TikTok and whether or in what form that could be wrested from its Chinese control, or how far it's actually seen as an instrument that's been useful for Trump in his politicking and passing certain messages. So I think we're going to see all sorts of contradictory moves in the coming months.
In a Financial Times op-ed in April about the antitrust case being prosecuted by the US government against Google, Nobel Prize-winning economist Daron Acemoglu compared today's big tech companies with the biggest companies in US history. In the article, Acemoglu points out that back in its day, Standard Oil was the biggest company of its time, with a market capitalisation of around $33 billion in today's dollar terms. And in 1911, the US Supreme Court ruled that it was an illegal monopoly, forcing it to split into 34 separate companies. By comparison, Google, Amazon and Apple are now worth $1.8 trillion, $1.8 trillion and $2.9 trillion, respectively. I ask Andrew if we are in uncharted waters here.
Yes, I think both in terms of the scale, as you say, and of course it's not just those core platforms, but then the whole ecosystems that are built up around it, digital marketing and approaches to advertising and so on. I think there's a lot of opacity around the operation of the big tech companies. And yes, that scale and the penetration into so many areas of our lives of tech is sparking huge debates around policymakers, researchers, and others about influence. Of course, we know historically, as you say, the oil companies, of course, and their breakup, but also, of course, for example, the telephone monopolies and the breakup were big and fundamental existential periods. The big robber barons at the end of the 19th, the early 20th century, all of these were great moments with huge political tension and backlash and lobbying. But of course, ultimately, when there was a clampdown, tougher regulation, a breakup of those monopolies of different sorts, it was seen as significantly a good thing in terms of the benefits to consumers, pricing, access, competition, and innovation. And incidentally, we've been seeing, of course, this huge clampdown on higher education in recent weeks. And of course, the instruments that the administration has been using are incredibly blunt. So while their nominal complaints have focused on lack of diversity of viewpoint or around claims of anti-Semitism, the instruments they've used largely have been about reducing federal funding for academic research. And that raises huge questions about, where in future money for fundamental medical research, for the development of technical areas, engineering and science more generally, computing, defense industries, all of those areas that through creating a very open system and a federally supported system of excellence made the US a vast magnet for innovation from around the world. So to see now those funds being squeezed, perhaps no longer being based primarily on merit, perhaps the overall level of funding being cut, and at the same time the pushback on welcoming high quality immigrants into the US as students or as academics, as well as business people, perhaps again threatens the dominance that we've seen of the US in recent decades.
It's a sobering portrait that Andrew paints, and as I leave him in Brooklyn to make my way uptown for my next meeting, I'm full of hope that my next Churchill Fellowship encounter will perhaps restore a little bit of faith in the future.
Purple bound and next stop will be 14th Street, Union Square, stand clear of closed doors.
The subway spits me out on East 82nd Street, where I've arranged to meet Megan Kiefer from an organisation called Take Two Media Initiative. The blurb on their website says their mission is to, quote, empower students to take control of their mental health by building media literacy, self-agency and resilience, unquote. In practice, that means they stage in-person media literacy workshops in elementary school classrooms across Greater New York. Megan has arranged for me to attend one of her workshops at a public school called PS 290 Manhattan, and I'm excited to go and spend time in the company of some real-life elementary school kids in a real-life New York City classroom. Newshounds, the digital literacy classroom resource we've developed at Squiz Kids, is in more than 4,500 classrooms across Australia, and I've spent a fair bit of time crisscrossing the country visiting classrooms and watching it in action. I'm fascinated to see how Megan's media literacy workshop is received.
Okay. Hi. So it's so great to be with you guys. This is our new cohort of a media ambassador.
The kids are super engaged. They're 5th and 6th graders from a mixture of families who've sent their kids to this public school in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Megan and her 2 volunteers have a winning rapport with the kids, walking them through many of the same sorts of topics and exercises that we get kids to tackle in our Newshounds program.
Forward. And this is Mr. Bryce, and Mr. Bryce is here all the way from Australia. Do you guys know where Australia is? Yeah? Where's Australia?
Afterwards, she walks me the 5 blocks across to 5th Avenue and explains how she's been doing this work, unpaid, since 2018, visiting schools and creating a network of youth ambassadors across New York's many boroughs, who, it's hoped, will in turn take the media literacy messaging back to their peers.
Just like any big sort of transformational cause or thing that, needs to actually get shifted, like recycling or smoking or Just Say No campaigns, the designated driver, like when they're in the hands of the youth and youth make it cool and they make it digestible and understandable and they take charge of a cause, it's actually way more powerful.
Sure. Through the program we do, I'm always struck at how perceptive children, because we teach to the same, 5th and 6th graders as well.
Great.
They're incredibly perceptive and when you start to talk to them about social media and they're quite sophisticated in their thinking around it. Do you find that?
When we talked about being an example for your kids around this stuff, I think it's always funny because the kids are always like, my mom and dad are on their phone all the time. They don't ever get out of their phone. When they come home, they're on their phone. And it's like these kids, they were brought up with parents that have their faces in their phones all the time. If your attention, which is something your kids want so badly, has been taken up by this box, this rectangular square.
Yes.
Like, of course, your kids are going to be like, this must be so important.
Yeah, it's more important than I am.
It's more important than anything else that's going on.
Yeah.
And it's like, we wonder why we have this, like, atrophy of human connection. It's because we just are doing everything in our phones, and
it's so true.
It kills it. It cuts off our inner voice. It cuts off our consciousness and connections and the loneliness epidemic. And it's like it's all connected. Like we're all lonely because we think we're connecting, but we're
not.
Join me next episode as I continue my travels in America, diving deeper into the media literacy movement in the US, meeting former journalists who have swapped the newsroom for the war room, and spending time with a woman who's built a nationwide community of digital literacy educators, inspired by her family's own painful experience of misinformation as a victim of one of the worst terrorist attacks the world has ever seen.
It is not lost on the American publications that we reach out to or news outlets that is a matter of survival, ultimately, for them.
This podcast has been made possible by the Winston Churchill Trust Australia. Thanks for listening to episode 2 of The Big Threat.